Hey everyone, we're here with Randy Silver, product consultant, author, and co-host of the Product Experience podcast. Randy, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you recently released a book, kind of timed right after the COVID-19 shock to everyone's strategic roadmaps, called "What Do We Do Now?" Can you share a little bit more about that book and kind of what you aimed to convey in it?
Yeah, thank you. So I started it as a discussion with a couple of friends about what at the beginning of lockdown, and they were all trying to figure out, okay, crap, what the hell do I do right now? And the conversations tended to take a very significant, or very, let me say that again. The conversations tended to take a very recurring motif, and the same things kept coming up again and again. So I sat down to write an article and take that conversation a little bit wider and see if I could open it up and have that conversation with a lot more people. And it turned out not to be an article. It just kept going and going and going. And so I realized there were about 10 points to it, and I wrote an outline and said, this may be better as a book. And Jeff Gotthelf and Josh Seiden published a series of business books under the Sense and Respond press banner. And I knew they were really good at this and just pitched them and asked them, would you be willing to do this really fast and put all the profits to charity? This feels wrong to try and profit from something like this, and let's see what good we can do in the world right now.
Yeah.
And they were kind enough and said yes, and just a few weeks later, we got the book out, and it's really about what are the conversations you should be having, what are the questions you should be asking with your team and your management team right now.
What are they?
Excellent question. Really, it's not significantly different from what you should be asking at any other point, except it's thrown into really sharp relief right now. Everything we do is based on a couple of basic things. It's based on what does the market look like and who are our customers and what are the problems that they have. And, you know, we've all done market analysis, hopefully, and we all have personas, hopefully. So you already know how to do this sort of thing. But everything you're doing in your sprints and your strategy and your roadmaps is based on a fact plus an assumption or hypothesis. The problem is those facts are now questionable, and the hypotheses that you made are also really questionable. So the first thing you have to do is go back to the beginning and say, what is still true? What does the market look like? And for our customers, who are they? What are their priorities? What are the problems they need to have solved right now? And what are they willing to pay for, either with attention or with money, to solve right now? And if we are not helping them, then we need to rethink what we're doing.
Yeah, so you're kind of describing the context that the customer lives in. What problems do they have? What is the environment that they're in? How much does the business that you have, that you're running, your product, how much does that play into what strategies are really available to you? Are you constrained at all by the business side of the equation?
Oh, absolutely. So first you have to decide what is it you're trying to do, and then you have to figure out how are you going to try and do it. And there's any number of the factors that come in there. First off, you have to make sure that you're still going to have a business.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a real problem for a lot of people right now. So that obviously has to come first. You're not helping anyone if your business isn't around to provide the context and provide an ongoing service, both for your customers, but also for yourself and your team. So that absolutely has to be of paramount concern. But beyond that, there's any number of things you have to think about is what are we capable of doing?
Mm-hmm.
And who's counting on us? So if what you're doing as a product or a service is part of somebody else's critical infrastructure, can you afford to let that go down right now? Can you, if you decide that you want to pivot or make a change, what's the second and third and fourth order effects of you not providing what you were doing or promising to do? Beyond that is any number of questions around what is your cycle time? If you're used to releasing annually or quarterly or monthly, do you have the ability to pivot quickly? You may or may not be able to really do that. Because it's not just about getting code into production. It's what about marketing? What about legal? What about support? What about sales? What about everyone else? And are your customers paying enough attention, or do they have access to the things that they need to have access to take what you're doing and make use of it? So you have to think about all of that entire ecosystem before you commit to a specific plan.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and maybe that's a good question. How do you involve cross-functional stakeholders in that conversation? Is it, hey, we thought about this in a silo. Here's the new strategy. Does this work with you all, or how do you build that kind of muscle of bringing them into that conversation?
Um, Jeff Patton did a really amazing presentation a couple of years ago at Mind the Product in Hamburg, and he put up a picture of a normal Scrum board, and except he had one column to the right of done, and that was the measurement column. And it was a really fantastic thing because it all of a sudden put everything in context, because you can have everything in production, but not have achieved the objective of what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
And the reason that's important, not only because it makes you focus on did we actually accomplish something, it brings different people to the conversation by nature. Because your daily stand-ups may still be more of a Scrum team or an Agile team, but now all of a sudden, marketing and sales and support and anyone else, any stakeholder that cares about that overall objective now has a valid reason to be there and looking at that board sometimes and being part of that conversation. So you can do this on a daily basis, but it's really important that somebody, whether it's a head of product or a CPO or somebody else in the organization, is taking a look at that. It's the same type of thing that Teresa Torres does really well with her opportunity solutions tree of laddering down what are your objectives to what are you actually working on. And whether your impact mapping does the same thing, there's a number of techniques to accomplish this, but the entire point is mapping back everything you're doing to the strategy and making sure that it ladders and makes sense.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good way to frame this next question, because I think, for a lot of people, they were working towards an outcome. They had a solution in mind. They were kind of in the process of building towards that strategy. You have a shock to the system. The strategy's obviously kind of been blown up. When do you make the call to pivot? If you've already invested towards some solution, some cost fallacy aside, do you still want to ship that? Do you want to get it out just to see if maybe there's something you can pivot from in that release that would be relevant, or do you just kind of go back to the drawing board immediately?
I mean, everything is a bit of an experiment, right? So there's no right answer in any of this. With product, the right answer is always, it depends, unfortunately. But it is, and it's not, the point of the book is not that I have the answers, because no one definitively has the answers. We'll do a bunch of studies in a few months' time, and we'll look back at who was successful and who wasn't. And we'll draw up some stories and say, this is obviously the right thing to do. My opinion is the right thing to do is make sure that you're having the conversation, because it's always like a risk assessment. It's always a bet. It's always based on the knowledge you have at the time. But the biggest mistake you can make is not having those conversations, both within your individual development teams, but also at that wider level. So make sure that those conversations are absolutely happening, and make sure that you've got the appropriate amount of input and that you've done the work, so that it's not just an opinion. One of the scariest things in the world is an opinion. It's an assumption plus an emotion. And assumptions are things that can be changed by facts. We always talk about the hippo comes in and says, I want this. And you always say, well, bring data. Data changes their mind. The problem is once there's an emotional component in it, it can be really much more difficult to do so. So try and figure out ways to have these conversations that are based on facts. And when you can't, when it is based on emotion, try and figure out how can you do that as an experiment and prove it right or wrong as quickly as possible, so that the person isn't doing it from an abstract place, that they're responding to something like, okay, we did try this. It didn't work for any number of reasons, but we found out, one of the other things that we do really, really badly in the Agile world is we talk about failing fast, and no stakeholder ever wants to hear the word fail. Just it's always about learning fast. We learned this quickly. We know your objective is to sell more widgets. The way that you wanted to do it doesn't seem to be working. We have an idea of a different way to do it that we can test very quickly. Are you up for that? Usually gets a much better response. but you also still have to have some credibility with the stakeholder, and make sure you have the right, you've done all the relationship management investments going into this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring kind of the opinions and assumptions up, because I think with strategy there is always some aspect of that kind of influencing it. Just invariably, like you said, the hippo is going to have a desire, a want, a vision, and you're kind of trying to balance that with the data. With something like this, how do you manage those conversations where maybe people in the room have a different vision for what's going to happen? I think when this hit, I can remember the conversations that we were having, trying to figure out, what does this actually mean? Like, what is going to happen from this? And everyone's got wildly different beliefs of what could follow. And I feel like that's the difficult piece, is really sussing out whose opinion is right, because it's going to be somewhat based on intuition, not data, when you're forecasting what's going to happen.
Sure, but that's the way of every business decision from your dot. It is always going to be someone based on someone's opinion. Someone has to make a call at a certain point.
Yep.
And you throw as much information as possible to try and make an informed decision. But the key thing is to make sure that everyone's actually committing to trying it, and that you have the regular checkpoints to validating, is this working? And you mentioned the sunk cost fallacy earlier. That absolutely comes into it, and you've seen any number of companies fail because of that, because they refuse to pivot based on a belief that something will continue to happen, or they just have to get over this one hump. This happens a lot from discussions I've had with people who work a lot with AI ML, in that it's really a prioritization decision a lot of the times. What's the most important thing for us to be doing right now? And there's no easy answer to this. I can talk about a couple of different ways of dealing with it. Let me talk about two things specifically, actually. There's one that's a portfolio investment theory. And this is something that I think, I'm trying to remember the name of it was Ray Dalio, I believe, whose book inspired it, and a woman named Lucy McLean did a really great talk about this. The idea being that 70% of your portfolio is, keep the lights on and get small incremental returns on it. And then it's the other things, and those things pretty much have to succeed. You're counting on them. So you have to have a lot of surety on that. But that other 30% is going to be some combination of higher risk but higher reward. So those are things that you're happy to see fail, but you're going to not give them a whole lot of rope, because if one hits out of 100, you're absolutely golden. But the other stuff, you have to have that baseline of that 70% of your portfolio, of your work, that's absolutely working. The other one was about decision making. And there's a guy named Roman Pickler who's done has got a really nice chart on his site about different ways of getting to decisions. Because we also have this fallacy of thinking that we need to get everyone to agree and align. And that's absolutely true. Sometimes you have to understand it's someone's decision to make, or you can delegate a decision, or sometimes you need to actually have everyone in agreement. And he's got a really nice chart showing different kinds of decision-making structures, and just saying, we're in this structure. You don't have a say. You have an advisement role in this one, but you're not making the call. And that's it for a period of time. But the better relationship management you have, and the better clarity you have about that, means that are keys to making that work.
Yeah, you brought up the portfolio investment theory, which is an interesting one, because I think one question I'd like to ask you is, with more crises incoming, I don't think we're done necessarily with shocks to the system, just because everyone's still trying to figure it out. How can we help build our organizations to be resilient in this environment? One, I think, like you said, is just having the conversation, but would love to kind of dig into that a little bit more, and kind of how companies should think about, where do we begin testing the waters for other things? Because, like you said, we've got to keep our core meat and potatoes. The lights need to stay on, but we need to start exploring other areas. What does that look like? How do people do it in this environment?
If I had the answer to that, unfortunately, I think this is one of those where it's going to be hindsight
Mm,
tells us certain things. And the problem with that is business success is a combination of making your own fortune and quite a bit of luck.
mhm.
And especially with these unexpected things that happen, bad luck can really hit us. And you can do everything right and still fail. Um, so, what's the right thing to do? I don't have a specific way to tell you of doing it. I think it's more about, like I said, it's about having the conversation and paying attention and giving yourself more chances to be right
Mhm.
is great, but you you can still have some really bad luck based on any number of factors, and it can absolutely sink you. Which sounds really depressing. I'm sorry for giving such a terrible answer to you.
No, I mean, I think it makes sense, right? When you're dealing with uncertainty, you're kind of opening yourself up to risk. But like you said, I think the key there is opening yourself up to the upside by giving yourself the opportunity for it. Because if you have zero experiments going and you're just focusing on what you've got today,
Mhm.
invariably something's going to come along and kill it. So it's really just got to have that muscle to kind of test the waters and find something new. Um,
Absolutely. And if there is some way you can safeguard that 70% and make sure that you've got a basis to work from, absolutely do that. That might be the most important thing right now is shoring up something.
yeah, yeah. Um, my last, I guess, question is, what makes an effective strategy? Is it top down or is it bottom up? Is it, people are in the boardroom looking at the market data and they come back out and they say, hey, this is what you all should be doing? Or is it found on the front lines with the insights found in kind of customer interviews and reported back? Where does strategy come from?
I don't think it can reasonably come from either and work, because both are short-sighted about things. People on the ground interviewing customers see things through a silo of what they're working on. Especially as you get to larger organizations, it's whatever you're working on, that is your job. So that is the most important thing to you. And you see everything through that view. And then at the high level, you may well have lost sight of how hard it is to implement something. And the second, third, fourth order effects. A decision seems easy at a high level, but may not be easy to actually implement. So it's about having that conversation both ways. I think it's in Stephen Bungay's book. There's this great thing about briefing and back briefing, and the idea being that the general, in this case, the board, makes the decision of we want to go in this direction. We've got a general view of what we want to achieve, and issues. I want you to achieve this objective, but not this. But they also very specifically ask for a briefing back and say, now tell me how you're going to achieve that. And if each team comes back and says something and it doesn't line up with the original assumptions of the board, then you know you've got a problem.
Mm,
And you can make sure that you iron it out or redo your strategy based on the realities on the ground.
mm.
So I think, again, it's still about having good conversations and getting information from both sides. And one of the key things that we in product are either blessed or cursed to have to do is the context switching. But it can be really, really hard if you're working on a specific product or feature team to see the full picture.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Well, Randy, I really appreciate your time this morning. This has been insightful, and I would love if you could just share a little bit more about your book and how people can find it.
Sure. So this is called What Do We Do Now? It's available definitely on Amazon. It should be on all other ebook stores as well. All profits from it are going to Doctors Without Borders, as we call it in the States, or Medicine Sans Frontières, as it's called everywhere else, and all towards pandemic relief. It is cheap as hell. I think it's $5 in the States and similar prices elsewhere. And it is a very short read. It's designed to be read in about half an hour,
Okay,
so you can go back to it as much as you'd like.
awesome. Well, thanks again, Randy. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kent. I really appreciate you having me on.